Sometimes, as we're reading our New Testament, we come across a passage that isn't exactly an Old Testament quotation, but does seem like it's pointing back to the Old Testament in some way. This is actually called an allusion, and the New Testament is really full of these places. Sometimes the New Testament authors are very clear that they're pointing to a passage within the Old Testament. They'll often mark these with the words, "Thus the Scripture was fulfilled," or "so the Scripture says," or something like that. But then there are these other places where they just kind of make passing references, and they're actually alluding to a body of knowledge that was a part of the first century worldview that maybe, or maybe not, we don't really have in our minds. And so, what I want to do in this session is try to understand how do we go about figuring out if there is an allusion or if it's just the New Testament author talking in a certain way. Richard Hayes has written a book, Echoes of Scripture in the Letters of Paul, and there he details several different criteria for allusions. Again, I think probably many of these criteria can be combined or whittled down, and so, in my opinion, the criteria for allusion really are just twofold for our purposes. Allusions will be spotted when we find a place that has similar wording. In other words, we read something and the wording sounds very close to what we find within the Old Testament, but also similar themes. We can ask the question, are there themes that occur within the New Testament that seem to overlap within themes in the Old Testament? In my opinion, if we begin to run all of these places where we feel like maybe there is an allusion, if we begin to run them through these criteria, what we'll find is that oftentimes there are places that are similarly worded and have similar themes. And as we begin to jump into that and study it more, I think our understanding of what the passages have to say will increase exponentially. To look at that, then, I want to look at a specific passage within the New Testament that you have probably heard before, but maybe you've never actually considered as a Messianic prophecy. The passage I want to look at is Mark chapter 10, verse 45. Mark 10:45 comes towards the end of Mark's gospel. In Mark 10, we find Jesus teaching about various different things, but then also towards the end of Mark chapter 10, he foretells his death a third time. Then, immediately after he foretells his death, and of course his disciples are clueless, they have no idea what he's really saying. Immediately after he does this, we have James and John responding to this prediction by asking, "Can we sit at your right and your left when you come into your kingdom?" Of course, this angers everyone else, perhaps not so much because they think it's a crazy request, but more perhaps because they didn't think to ask it first. And so, in the midst of the anger and the tension within the 12 disciples, Jesus responds and says, "Hey, this is not for me to grant." But then he goes on to describe what type of king, more or less, he came to be. What does it mean for him to be the Messiah? He describes what it's like. He says in verse 42, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you." Why? Because of what he goes on to say. "Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all." And then here we have Mark 10:45, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." When we hear these words, to give his life as a ransom for many, surely we're thinking death, especially following Jesus' prediction of his death for the third time. We must realize that his mention of a ransom actually is referencing his own death. Jesus' way, then, is one that involves a road to death, but it's a road of humility and servanthood. This completely upends their ideas of what it means to be a Messiah, and really is a paradigm-shifting moment. Mark 10:45, however, seems to have a couple of allusions to the Old Testament, and this is what I want to look at together within this session. First of all, I want to look at the book of Daniel. Daniel, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Daniel is an interesting book, scary for many. The beginning chapters of Daniel aren't so scary. We have lots of interesting stories. It's scary for the participants in the book of Daniel, getting thrown into a fiery furnace or thrown into a den of lions. I imagine that was a scary experience. But it's really in the second half of Daniel when we start to feel a little bit nervous and scared. There's beasts and creatures and all of these strange things appearing. We begin to wonder, who is this? Is this a prediction of what will happen in the end? We don't really understand what's going on in the last half of Daniel. Daniel chapter 7, then, is one of these first passages that actually refers to one of these visions that Daniel has. He has this vision of 4 beasts, and in this vision, he walks through each of these beasts. They're terrifying creatures. And yet, as he moves through the beasts, he finds the 4th beast, right? And then that 4th beast had on it 10 horns. And then there were 3 horns, which were plucked up by the roots. Okay? But then, even in this moment, all of a sudden, the Ancient of Days appears. That's God. And as God appears, right, it says in verse 9, thrones were placed, the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and the court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. And we all hold our breath. What's going to happen? The Ancient of Days, who is more powerful than any of these beasts, is now standing in judgment over them. And then, just like that, I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, just like that. It's over, because the Ancient of Days has appeared. But then, verse 13, listen to this. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. In verse 14, to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall never pass away, in his kingdom, one that shall not be destroyed. I think this is the background for what we find in Mark chapter 10, verse 45. What are some of the similarities that you see between Mark 10:45 and Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14? As I look, it seems to me there's several things that stand out. First of all, they come, right? We find the Son of Man coming, and then also in Mark 10:45, the Son of Man did not come, okay? And so, first, the mention of come. This is what we might call a strength or a positive connection. Then we also have serve, right? We find this idea of service in Daniel chapter 7, 13, and 14. And then perhaps the strongest connection, right, is just this title, Son of Man. However, there are a few pieces of Daniel chapter 7 which don't seem to correspond. In fact, if we look at the text, it seems pretty clear that there is no suffering for the Son of Man, right? He doesn't seem to suffer at all. And in fact, he doesn't even seem to serve at all. In fact, others serve him. And so, here is the Son of Man standing before the throne in the Ancient of Days, and yet all of the people around are actually the ones who serve him. And he doesn't seem to be serving anyone. And so, we have to ask, does this meet our criteria for an allusion in Mark chapter 10, verse 45? Remember, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Well, yes, I think there is similar wording, right? We see Son of Man, we see serve, we see come, and yet, even though there are similar themes, we're left with some questions. Is it an allusion? Yes, I think so, but it seems strange that it's used in this way, and perhaps we're not quite sure how it fits. The answer, I think, lies in another allusion that I think Jesus is making, and that comes not from Daniel chapter 7, but from Isaiah chapter 53, verses 10 through 12. In Isaiah chapter 53, we find Isaiah speaking about the servant who is to come. This servant, he began at the end of 52 to describe this servant who will act wisely. He will be high, lifted up, and exalted. And yet he begins to describe the incredible suffering that this servant will undergo. As he moves through Isaiah 53, we're just struck by how terrible some of the suffering of the servant is going to be. And verse 10 of Isaiah 53 says this, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteousness, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors." Here in Isaiah 53, what we have is a description of a coming servant who will suffer in an incredible way. As we compare it to Mark chapter 10, verse 45, I think we can see a few similarities, right? First of all, we have the servant. He is, in fact, called a servant because he came in order to serve. We also find mention of bearing sins. This sounds a lot like our talk of ransom, right? Bearing the sins of many. But also notice the role of suffering. In fact, the servant is going to suffer. These are the similarities. Are there any differences that we notice? Any weaknesses, perhaps, in this connection? And I think the weakness has to be this: no mention of the Son of Man. The Son of Man is not found, that terminology, in Isaiah 53. Instead, it is just a reference to the servant who will suffer. And so, as we look at Isaiah 53 and Daniel 7, I think what we have to ask is, are there ways in which these connect to Mark chapter 10? And if so, what is Jesus doing? What is Mark doing as they present this story to us? We walk away from both Daniel 7 and Isaiah 53 with questions. It seems like an allusion. There's similar wording. There are similar themes. But neither one of them seems to fit it completely. And this, I think, is part of the idea. In fact, over time, as biblical history develops, we find that These same themes are actually talked about or discussed in other places. We see several places that talk about God's plan and God's will being exalted, right? But then this whole idea of a suffering servant is found in many places throughout the Old Testament. I'm thinking specifically of Psalm 22, this description of the incredible suffering that this righteous person will undergo. Psalm 22, of course, quoted by Jesus on the cross. And so, as we move back to Mark chapter 10, verse 45, we have to ask, what is Jesus doing? In my opinion, I think what he's doing is looking at Daniel 7, which would have been first and foremost in his disciples' minds of what his messiahship was going to look like. But then he's combining it with Isaiah chapter 53. You see, the disciples thought he was going to be a Messiah who would rule. They looked at passages like Daniel 7 and they got excited. The coming Son of Man, to him all nations will flock and they will serve. This seemed like a mighty one, a powerful one, a ruling one. And by uniting themselves to the Messiah, surely they were going to find themselves in positions of power. Hence the request of James and John. Can we sit at your right and at your left when you come in your kingdom? This is what they expected the Messiah to be. And yet, as far as we know, before Jesus came on the scene, no one was really reading Isaiah 53 and thinking this is what the Messiah will be and will do. It was a confusing passage for them, one that they didn't really understand. And I think what Jesus is saying is this: I do fulfill Daniel chapter 7, but I also fill Isaiah 53. What is true of Daniel 7 and Isaiah 53 are true of me. We might call this then an ironic use of the Old Testament. Jesus is turning their expectations on their head. Jesus will indeed suffer. He will indeed be ransomed for many, and yet he is still the Son of Man. If we look closer at the context of Daniel chapter 7, we realize that, just as we remember in our guiding principles, one person can represent many. So the Son of Man seems to represent the people. Well, all of the people in Daniel chapter 7 do suffer. So it doesn't actually seem so far-fetched that the Son of Man himself may in fact suffer. And as we look at it, is there a sense in which we as the people come and serve the Son of Man? Well, sure. But the reality is we serve him because he was first a servant to us. And so this seems to me to be a prophetic fulfillment in many ways. Jesus is both the Son of Man, coming in power from Daniel chapter 7, but also the suffering servant from Isaiah 53. One final note. Don't miss the connection with the ruling of the Gentiles in Mark chapter 10 and the beasts in Daniel 7. The beasts are these powerful world forces who seem like they're more daunting and powerful than anything the people can imagine. There's hopelessness as the beasts rule, and perhaps there's a hopelessness in the minds of the early disciples. And yet, when the Son of Man appears, all of that fades away because of his power and because of his glory. So also, the Son of Man, when he comes, the Messiah himself, Jesus, will be the Son of Man from Daniel 7, merged together with the suffering servant from Isaiah 53. He is the Messiah who was expected to come, but he didn't come like people expected him to. And this idea changes everything.